Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Sally Thurston from the Maynard Public Library, and we're delighted to have Jane Oneail with us for another talk. Um, we are in webinar mode tonight, and we'll be using the Q&A for questions. So feel free to put questions in the Q&A as soon as they occur to you. Um, and we'll get to those at the end of the talk. I think that's all the technical things we have to do. Um, As always, I want to thank our wonderful friends group for funding this program and so much of what we do. Um, and I think without further ado, let's get started. Jane Oneail leads Culturally Curious and presents art appreciation programs throughout New England. She holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from Harvard University. She's worked at some of New England's most esteemed cultural institutions and is one of our very favorite presenters. So over to you, Jane. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sally. Thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your day. I thought this, um, I thought this subject would just fit in really well with America's 250th anniversary. There's something really rich about going back to the beginning, and the Peale family. Let me tell you, it's where everything starts. This is such a rich subject, and I had so much fun putting this program together. It's really the story of a family business. And we all probably know someone whose child sort of walked in their footsteps, went right into the same thing that their parent did. Maybe you're watching your own child do that just this very moment. But rarely is that business art. And never before had one family had such a significant impact on one nation's arts and culture. So the Peels were painters, naturalists, they were inventors, they were showmen, we will see, and they built this remarkable dynasty. So sit back and relax and let's get to know the remarkable Peale family. We will definitely be getting back to this image on the screen. To get us started, of course, here is our program overview. We basically have four main characters tonight, and our patriarch, who we see on the screen, is Charles Willson Peale. He was a Renaissance man by the very definition. Then we are going to look at three of his sons. There's great alliteration here. There's Raphaelle, Rembrandt, and Rubens. This is just a taste of some of his children. And if these are our main characters, there's a lot of other actors who are waiting in the wings to kind of weave into the story. Now, I do just want to point something out. Willson here, Charles Willson Peale, does have two L's, as does the name Raphaelle. Some little quirky spellings here. So these are going to be our main characters. So let's just dive right in with Charles Willson Peale. There's so much to cover here. As our patriarch, we're going to be spending a little extra time with him. We can see his birth and death dates here. So he was here for the revolution and made a significant impact following it. So Charles Willson Peale, born in 1741, he began his life with almost nothing, and he became a saddler's apprentice in Maryland, and he was teaching himself how to paint in the meantime. But in the 1760s, there was basically just a group of admirers of his work that thought that this man deserved a shot at becoming a professional artist. And they funded his trip across the ocean to London so that he could get the best training any American had access to at the time, which was to study with the artist Benjamin West. He ran a place called the American School in London. This is a little painting by another artist named Matthew Pratt of just what the American School looked like. We can sort of picture Charles Willson Peale there getting that training. And the man who ran that school, Benjamin West, was apparently so struck by this unusual talent that was Charles Willson Peale that he painted this portrait of the young man who was probably in his early 20s at that moment that we see over here on the right. So he's making an impact right off the bat. But then Charles Willson Peale returns home. He's young, he's trained, he's ambitious, and he's ready to build this career. But then, of course, a revolution breaks out. And Charles Willson Peale didn't just paint the revolution, he fought in it. He served in the Pennsylvania militia, and he was there through some of the militia's most brutal battles. He fought at Trenton, he fought at Princeton, and he basically had a paintbrush in one hand and a rifle in the other. This was a self-portrait that he painted during the British occupation of Philadelphia, and it shows us a man who understood firsthand what was at stake here. We see him as a soldier, as a patriot, as this witness to history. And here he is in the thick of it. He meets George Washington right from the get go, and his London training prepared him to start making beautiful portraits of significant leaders. This is a portrait of George Washington when he was just in his 40s. This is from 1774. At this point in his career, he was the colonel of the Virginia Regiment. So a little bit of foresight, sort of understanding this man was on the right trajectory. Now, I've compared it here to a portrait by a British artist named Joshua Reynolds. And this shows us that at this early stage in his career, Charles Willson Peale is just taking all of those lessons that he got while he was in Europe and applying it to his American subjects here. So we've got a 3/4 length portrait of a military leader set in a kind of pastoral setting, almost the same pose with the hand tucked into the jacket there. And we get the sense that Washington and Peale at this moment are on this upward trajectory. So Peale continues to paint Washington. This next portrait of Washington is actually America's first official state portrait. We're going to hear a lot of firsts tonight. This one was commissioned in 1779 by the Pennsylvania Council Chamber, and it celebrated Washington's victory at Princeton. So this is actually the Nassau Hall of Princeton University in the background. But Peale had been there, so he knew exactly what it looked like. He's showing like prisoners of war walking in the background. So we have this notion of sort of the towering figure that is George Washington, was George Washington. We know he was 6'2", but in this painting, he's actually 8 feet tall, and he looks confident, relaxed. He looks like a proven leader who has just won a war, right? He's on his way to winning the war. So Charles Willson Peale knows Washington's face very well. He goes on to paint it, I think, something like 60 more times. These are just two examples of miniature portraits that he created of George Washington, which you could imagine would be a sort of a lower cost item that he could sell to other maybe middle class people. And over the course of his artistic career, Charles Willson Peale shows Washington in the full arc of his professional career, from like Virginian plantation owner to general to all the way to president. So he only had 7 sittings with him from life, but from there he produced all of these 60 portraits. Now, there's something really nice and intimate about a miniature, right? And this became a part of what Charles Willson Peale was producing in addition to all of his commissions. And eventually he realized he needed some help. And what we're looking at here on the left is Charles Willson Peale's portrait of his own brother named James. Now, James had been assisting him with portrait commissions. He'd been building frames. In fact, Charles Willson Peale trained his brother himself. But at a certain point, as his career began to rise, he said to his brother James, "I'm just going to give you all of the miniature portrait commissions from this day forward." And so we can see his brother working at his easel, painting those very miniatures. Also over here on the right, I believe this is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum, a self-portrait by his brother James too. So it's already like a piece of the dynasty here. It's already a big business, and we haven't even left the revolution yet. Now, James did occasionally make paintings that were not miniatures. In this case, this is a copy of a painting that his brother Charles Willson Peale had done. It's Washington at Yorkshire, and or Yorktown, I should say. And I just wanted to share this because it's so utterly charming, because James Peale painted himself and his brother Charles Willson Peale just standing right there behind George Washington. Like, needed to prove their admiration and the fact that they're right there in the fray. There's something very endearing about that to me. Now, Charles Willson Peale understood that a new nation needed a visual record of all of the people that started it. And his vision was was of who belonged, I think, was probably more expansive than the average person. So we are looking at a portrait of a man named Joseph Brandt. His Mohawk name was Tyen Dananega, and he had enormous political and military significance. Peale painted him in 1797 with the same kind of direct, unflinching eye that he brought to Washington and, as we'll see, other leaders. In this portrait, Peale emphasizes Brandt's role as a negotiator. He's not dressed for war here. He's dressed for discussion, and he was there in Philadelphia to actually negotiate a treaty on behalf of the Mohawk people. What's kind of fun here is you might be wondering about some of the elements of his costume. He is actually wearing the same metal pendant here that George Washington had in an earlier portrait. That would have been like a formal part of an old-fashioned suit of armor called a gorget. Here it's worn more like a military necklace, sort of signifying things. Now, Peale didn't just paint the founders. In so many ways, he was one of them. If we're thinking about who he knew and the circles that he moved through, he was constantly talking to people of power, people who had curiosity and ambition. And here is, of course, his portrait of Thomas Jefferson on the left. They were close friends. Thomas Jefferson was a real kindred spirit to him. They were both interested in art and science and democracy. And for them, all of those things were part of this great big project that was democracy. So on the right, we see a device that's known as a polygraph, and that is not a lie detector. It's essentially an ingenious way of copying letters. You can think of it as like the very first photocopier, but the idea here is you write with one of these pens, and this contraption essentially creates a copy of exactly what you're writing in real time. Now, Charles Willson Peale did not invent this machine, but he owned the American patent to it. And there's all these letters. And I should say, he gave one to Thomas Jefferson. And there's all these letters back and forth between the two of them about how to tweak and improve this ingenious device that's in front of them. So it's sort of like two Renaissance men here admiring this gadget that neither one of them could resist improving along the way. Now, another one of the founding fathers that Peale was very connected to was Benjamin Franklin. The artist first encountered Benjamin Franklin back when he was studying in London. And apparently at that time, he walked into a room where Benjamin Franklin was canoodling with someone. And young Charles Willson Peale sort of knew that he wasn't supposed to be there, but he did not leave. Instead, he sat down and he sketched the very act, something that I think most of us would rather have left to our imagination, but I find this very funny. So by the time Peale painted this formal portrait of Benjamin Franklin 2 decades later on the right, the two men had become great intellectual allies. And it's worth noting that pictures of I should say paintings of people wearing glasses at this time it's exceedingly rare, but we will see a handful of them today. Ben Franklin is, of course, wearing his bifocals here. We can even zoom in and see that they have the little lenses there. He's often credited with discovering or inventing bifocals. Apparently, there's some dispute around that, but what we'll see is that Charles Willson Peale ends up wearing them too. Now, both of these men, Peale and Franklin, were tireless experimenters, and they also believed in curiosity as being like a civic virtue. And an understanding of the natural world was all part of building a better world. Their friendship ran so deep that Charles Willson Peale would eventually have a son that he named Benjamin Franklin Peale, because some friendships really are worth writing into the family tree. So this brings us to Charles Willson Peale and his museum. In 1786, he did something that basically no other American had done before. He opened a museum that was equal parts art gallery, natural history, and civic statement. He had portraits of the founding fathers on the wall, along with bird specimens and fossils. So it's kind of like the heroes of the revolution were sharing this space with wonders of the natural world. It's all under one roof. It's all open to the public. This was known as the Philadelphia Museum. It's often called the Peale Museum. And Peale said it was it existed to, quote, instruct the mind and sow the seeds of virtue in the new republic. Although I think the tagline on the poster here is a little catchier. It's really sweet. Amusement here with sciences combined to please and improve and cultivate the mind. It's very sweet. Now, on the right, this is a painting of the original museum building, which was attached to the Peale family home. They built a 66-foot long gallery to house all of these collections. And then Peale built the very first skylights in our country in order to have all of this well illuminated. So many firsts in this along the way. What we will see is that this museum finds several different houses along the way because funding a museum is always an issue. But Peale was a visionary, so he's always chasing after money. And in 1794, he launched a subscription service to his museum, and he had a plan that would make really any development officer like weep with envy. His first subscriber was the sitting president of the United States, George Washington. I know it's a little bit hard to see, but that is his signature right there at the top. He also got John Adams, and in addition to that, 87 other members of Congress to sign on. So everybody's buying subscriptions, but he still couldn't get any federal dollars for this. Now, right around the turn of the century, something extraordinary happens for Charles Willson Peale. He had, this collection of natural history items, but this would be forever changed because in 1801, a 15,000-year-old mastodon fossil was discovered on a farm in the Hudson River Valley. Believe it or not, Thomas Jefferson tried to buy it immediately, but he was unsuccessful. So then Charles Willson Peale moved very quickly. He paid the farmer $200 for this fossil. He gave dresses to the farmer's wife. He gave a gun to the farmer's son. And then he had all these people come in and essentially dredge this swamp where the mastodon fossils were. It was a huge undertaking. And 5 years later, he painted the whole scene. So here are the people dredging this swamp so that they can find the mastodon bones. Here is Charles Willson Peale right over here holding a drawing of those bones. Even one of his sons was there who also did the drawing of the mastodon that we see over on the right. Charles Willson Peale actually added 20 family members into this painting, although there was really only one son there. We'll see family looms large. This brings us to this incredible self-portrait from 1822. It's Charles Willson Peale sort of at the end or height of his career, and we can see that his original museum, it's outgrown its first home, and now it's actually in the very building of Independence Hall. 40 years earlier, the Declaration of Independence has been signed in the same building. Seems like a fitting space for this artist to show off all of this lifetime of accomplishments here. So in this gallery that he's sort of like dramatically raising the curtain for us to see, there are presidents of or portraits of the presidents, the founding fathers, all along the top. There's all of these taxidermy birds inside here as well. And then, of course, like the star of the show really is that mastodon fossil, because it was huge. At its shoulder, it was 11 feet high. I think they would charge an extra fee to go see the mastodon skeleton, and they would make about $8,000 a year just off of the mastodon skeleton itself. So I believe it was I think it was the second only assembled prehistoric skeleton in the world. It was a big deal. So I also want to point out how Peale is presenting himself here. He's dressed all in black. He's sort of gesturing to us. Whenever I look at this painting, I'm always reminded of this earlier portrait of George Washington, painted by another leading artist of the Young Republic, a man by the name of Gilbert Stuart. And Gilbert Stuart sort of encompasses this notion of Republican virtue and Republican values in this leader, or in this portrait of our leader, who's not wearing a crown, he's not dressed in regalia. There's simplicity to who he is, and there's an emphasis on his intellect here. And I think Peale was very self-consciously trying to quote that here as well, although he brings a little bit of showmanship to this role, as in that he's lifting that kind of grand manner red curtain in the background. One other interesting thing about Peale and this portrait is that he was in his 80s when he painted it, and he became, as so many of us do as we get older, really interested in the notion of aging well. And while he was in Washington lobbying for more money for his museum, he heard about a man named Yarrow Mammoet who lived in the area and was purported to be 140 years old. We can see Charles Willson Peale's portrait of Mahmoud over on the right. Now, he knew that this man was not 140, he was probably about 83. But Peale also knew that this Muslim man who'd been formerly enslaved had sort of mastered this art of perseverance, of sobriety, and of living well. And Peale wanted to capture that and celebrate that in this portrait. This is apparently the first portrait in America of a Muslim man. And I think it's a surprisingly humanistic portrait, too, of a Black man in the first quarter of the 19th century in America. Now, Charles Willson Peale had a very thorny relationship with slavery and with race in this country. He was most certainly a slave owner. I don't know exactly how many slaves he owned, but I do know he had a slave named Moses Williams, and he trained Moses Williams to use this device that we see over here on the right. It was called a physiognotrace, and it basically was a way to make these tiny silhouettes. This became almost like a calling card of the museum experience. So Moses Williams is situated in the museum, and he's making these little cutout portraits for anybody who could pay a few cents for them. Now, just the physiognotrace itself is kind of rooted in racism and this belief that the shape of your head and the outline of your features sort of speaks to your status and in what was believed to be a hierarchy of races. Something like this was an argument for enslaving people. And here, Charles Willson Peale has employed a Black man to do this, a person he had enslaved. Now, the amazing thing is that Moses Williams was, I guess, incredibly talented at this. This is actually a portrait of Moses Williams. This is in the University of Pittsburgh Art Gallery. And so now we see Moses Williams, but we'll only ever know him through this profile. And Peale would eventually free him. Moses Williams would go on to continue working for Peale, continue making these silhouette portraits, and he would earn enough money to buy himself a two-story house. But the fact remains that the man who painted Yarrow Mammoet with all of this humanity and understanding still had this issue that he was enslaving other Black people in this country. It's a fascinating and sort of horrifying contradiction. Now, before we round out our look at Peale's museum, I just want to note sort of what happened to this incredible collection that he built up. After he passed away, years after he passed away, they held a public auction for a number of those items, and many items in the natural history collections were actually purchased by P.T. Barnum and went to his museum, and then of course Barnum and Bailey eventually collaborate for the famous touring circus that most of us know. The portraits went to what is now the Independence National Historic Park. And then what happened to that mastodon? The mastodon still exists. It's in a museum in Germany, and you can still go and see it today. It's still as impressive as it ever was. Now, if this was any other man, if Peale was anybody else, we would just wrap this up. What a life he had, right? And then move on. But Peale's greatest legacy wasn't his collections or his connections, but rather it was his family. And this is Peale's portrait of his family that he started in 1773. So pre-revolution. This is before the museum, before the revolution, way before the Mastodon too. He continued to sort of edit and tinker with this family portrait up until 1809. But really, this was considered the most ambitious group portrait by any colonial era artist. So we see around this table the seeds of everything, the children that would grow up to be artists in their father's footstep. We can see the brother who specialized in the miniatures right over here, and we can see Charles Willson Peale himself, who's holding the painter's palette. He's been working at the easel back here. This is his wife, his sister, his mother, and a nurse over here. Even some of the sculptures back here feature Charles Willson Peale and his teacher. We, of course, also have a wonderful dog in the foreground and this trompe l'oeil effect of the knife coming off of the table as though it's coming out towards us. And that knife has done something very useful. It's peeled the fruit in the still life element here. And the peel is a way for Charles Willson Peale to have like a little pun and signature for his work. It's a play on his name, of course. So all sorts of incredible things happening in this ambitious early self-portrait. Now, Peale would go on to have a huge family of his own. Family was so important to him. Over his lifetime, he had 3 wives and he fathered 17 children. And he developed a naming convention that left absolutely nothing to chance. Peale called his sons Raphaelle, Rembrandt, Rubens, Titian, and he called his daughters after famous women artists, including Angelica Kauffman and Sophonisba Anguissola. So he's broadcasting his ambitions to the world and his ambitions for his children before these kids could even hold up their heads, let alone hold a paintbrush. But the image on your left reminds us that the dynasty was built on grief as well, because even though he had 17 children, he lost a number of them. A fair number of these kids did not survive past infancy or childhood. So this is a portrait of his first wife mourning the loss of one of their early children. And of course, Charles Willson Peale shared in that grief too. Then we have another self-portrait of the artist painting that same wife with one of their daughters in the background. And note what the daughter's doing. She's reaching for her father's paintbrush. She's ready to take on that role as he imagined each one of his children would be. As these children are growing up, Charles Willson Peale created this incredible, ambitious painting called the Staircase Group. And here we see 2 of his sons that are named for great masters. This is really like he's considered his oldest son, the first son to really survive into adulthood. This is Raphaelle Peale on the steps, and up top, this is Titian Peale who's looking out at us. This was painted in 1795, and it presents these 2 young men as like the heirs to this great dynasty that everything that their father had built, and they seem confident, they seem talented, and they're literally rising. They are ascending in this moment. We've got Raphaelle who's holding his palette, he's holding his artist maul stick, which is something that an artist uses. They prop it up against the canvas and it steadies their hand while they're painting. And Raphaelle, the oldest, who's looking out at us here, he would go on to be one of America's great still life painters. Titian over here, who's named for the Venetian master, would go on to become a celebrated naturalist and scientific illustrator. So it's proof in this household, at least, that the arts and the natural sciences are all just sort of branches off of this big tree of American culture. Now, a couple of really fun details. Look at what's at the bottom of this painting, right along Raphael's foot. There is a little piece of paper there that's painted very illusionistically. It is actually a ticket to Peale's museum. So we will see that he never misses the opportunity to self-promote. It's the showman in him, right? We can also see here now that the painting is framed in a really unusual way. It's framed to look as though it was a door, and it even has a step that projects out from it. Now, this painting would eventually be displayed in Peale's museum, and legend has it that George Washington himself walked into the space, saw these two young men that he recognized, and supposedly bowed to them in recognition. I mean, that alone is just such a great story that could like seal your reputation, right? I want to share with you images of this work from different perspectives here too, just to show you. I mean, it is an astonishingly illusionistic work. So we can see that Charles Willson Peale was really like at the top of his game when he painted this. So he's naming his kids after these famous artists. I mean, so much pressure and expectation there. But he also named his children after scientists too. We already know that he named one of them after Benjamin Franklin. The little baby here is named Charles Linnaeus. This is also a portrait by Charles Willson Peale. Charles Linnaeus was a great Swedish botanist who gave the world a system for classifying all living things. So that name became Charles Willson Peale's like mission statement. So as other people were collecting things in the world, they were essentially creating like little cabinets of curiosity, strange wonders to delight your eye. But instead, Charles Willson Peale was approaching this as a scientist. He's organizing this, all of his collections into this Linnaean taxonomy. He's making sense of the world around us and their relationships to everything else. So incidentally, the watercolor of his gallery that we're looking at over here on the right was actually a collaboration between Peale and his artist son Titian. So everything comes back to the family, right? Charles Willson Peale even adopted an orphaned nephew who was named Charles Willson Peale Polk. Actually, just Charles Peale Polk. Sorry. This is a self portrait by Charles Peale Polk. He was also trained by Charles Willson Peale and ended up becoming an artist in his own right. Charles Peale Polk mostly just copied the works of his uncle, but he made a living at doing that. This is a Charles Willson Peale over here on the left. This is his adopted nephew's version of the same painting. I don't know how successful it is in the face, but there's some nice flourishes there with the costume. So everybody around him is turning into an artist for better or for worse. Maybe he was just the best trainer there was. We are going to use this self-portrait to close out just this section on Charles Willson Peale. And it's this wonderful, intimate image. He's popped up these tiny homemade bifocals on his forehead, and he's giving us the chance to get a better look at him. And by any measure, Charles Willson Peale was one of the most remarkable Americans who ever lived. He was a soldier, a painter. He created over 1,000 portraits during his lifetime. He excavated a mastodon fossil from a swamp. He was an inventor and a museum founder. But it's perhaps his greatest achievement is really what he set into motion. This family that he gave birth to and christened and set in this direction of the art world. So we're going to turn our attention to his technically firstborn son, Raphael, who turns out to be a tragic talent. That was Raphael, you remember, on the staircase in Charles Willson Peale's painting. This is a portrait of Raphael by his father over here on the right. He was one of art history's most luminous talents, especially considering his name, and he lived one of the saddest stories. So we can see him here positioned as an artist with palette in hand. We can also see what we can safely assume is one of his still life paintings with that signature Peale in the background. But he struggled. He was emulating his father, but he never quite measured up. And his father very quickly dismisses him. So Raphael also has a very large family, somewhere around 9 kids. Some of them predeceased him as well. And it was difficult for him to support all of them. He often went to his father looking for money. So what we will see is that Raphael sort of takes refuge in these still life paintings. But his father considered that sort of the lowest form of art. So initially, Raphael's trying to follow in his father's footsteps. He's trying to do portrait painting just like his father. And here we're looking at a really remarkable portrait. This is of a man named Absalom Jones. He was born enslaved in Delaware. He purchased his own freedom. He co-founded the Free African Society, became the first African American to be ordained an Episcopal priest. And we see him sitting here with this quiet authority. He's got his robes, his Bible, and this sort of steady gaze here. And again, it's a rare painting from this era that shows an African American subject with this incredible dignity and humanity. So this is Raphael falling into his father's footsteps, trying to measure up to this legacy, but then his health catches up with him. By 1813, his health has essentially collapsed. He can't walk without crutches. From that moment forward, he is putting all of his attention into still lifes. And like I said, his father dismissed this. It was beneath the dignity of the Peale name, essentially. And what we see in these small, intimate paintings, little pieces of fruit and cake and maybe some liquor in a glass, they are among the most technically brilliant works that were produced in early America. What Charles Willson Peale had dismissed, the art world would eventually come to celebrate and appreciate. So Raphael Peale may have had to retreat into like still life, but he was also able to conquer it. Here are two more examples of his still life paintings. He's sort of working in this Dutch Baroque tradition. It kind of gives him his formal vocabulary here, just like a shelf with a dark background and then sweet little things in the foreground that draw our attention to things like flowers and strawberries and the reflection on these beautiful surfaces here. Uh, the interesting contrast is that the Dutch Baroque tradition was always to show pieces of fruit, flowers, what have you, a little bit past their prime, starting to decay. It's this reminder that beauty fades and time wins. But Raphael had no sense of that. It's a young country, it's full of ambition. And so he gives us this abundant, kind of pristine, at its peak of ripeness view of these still lifes. There's all this kind of confidence baked into these scenes. Now we can see two more of the still lifes here, and now we get the contradiction that was Raphael Peale, because as his health is collapsing, he's suffering from gout. He becomes alcoholic, and he's sort of going back and forth between indulging in food, indulging in alcohol, and it's all kind of slowly debilitating for him. So imagine what it felt like to be Raphael Peale, slowly capturing and gazing upon these things that would just absolutely devastate him if he were to ingest it. We think of his still lifes as these paintings about longing and sort of like self-denial. And that sense of self-denial, I think, really comes out in still life that's called Peaches Covered by a Handkerchief. He's kind of adding a veil to these delicious peaches. He's making them just a little bit inaccessible here. He's even added this giant wasp to the composition and another fly over here. It's like this reminder, you shall not touch this. And it's all done again with this beautiful illusionism. I especially love like this like ribbon liner to all of this too. The full fruition of this sense of denial and veiling comes to us by way of this. I think it's one of his last and certainly his greatest still life. There's no fruit here, though. This one is called Venus Rising from the Sea dash a Deception. This is his masterpiece. We are looking at a painted sheet, or essentially like a napkin, really, that is painted with this technical ferocity here. We can see that it's been pressed. We see all of the creases in it. So many people have looked at this and just wanted to reach out and lift it up. And of course, they want to lift it up because there's the suggestion of a nude woman standing behind it, too. So now, again, we have this sense of desire and veiling and denying yourself of something. This is, of course, sort of like a little wink at the famous painting of the Birth of Venus from Botticelli, going back hundreds of years. Here we have Venus kind of rising from the sea. but Raphael gives us a pressed napkin instead of a nude goddess. It's all the more remarkable that it was painted by a man who was dying. He could barely hold a brush at the time that he created it, and he will passed away about 3 years after its completion. And to round out our look at Raphael, I just want to bring it back to that self-portrait from his father. These two works were made the same year. And it gives us this incredible contrast between the way these two men moved through the world. Here you have Charles Willson Peale lifting the curtain, revealing this organized display, this organized understanding of the world around us. And then you have his son, who's painted this most beautiful curtain you could ever imagine. And he is veiling the world. He's shrouding the things that he desired and that he could not have. In his final months, he was too sick to paint. So the only way he could make money was actually by writing these like little lovesick poems that he would then give to a baker to put into sweet pastries. It's like, it's all so tragic, right? He died at the age of 51. He was mostly dismissed by his father. He was largely overlooked as an artist in his era, but today he is recognized as one of the greatest talents of early America due to his wit and his invention. So if Raphael was not his father's favorite, who was? Let me tell you. It was Rembrandt Peale. He was the golden child. Here we can see Rembrandt Peale, the second son, in a portrait painted by his father over here on the left. And I just want to draw your attention to the fact that he's not painted as an artist. He instead is painted in this beautiful pastoral setting. It practically looks like he's sitting in front of Niagara Falls. We've got like this glowing sun setting behind the mountains over here. This is sort of like this gallant setting that you might associate with his early portraits of George Washington. He's named his son Rembrandt, and he expects the world of him. This is the son that's going to live up to his name. And so he gives Rembrandt all of the opportunities that he never gave Raphael. He pays for him to study abroad. He gives him access to all of the movers and shakers that are in his circle. And it was Rembrandt that went with his father to go and excavate that mastodon skeleton. Here's Rembrandt Peale in the back of, oh wait, no, this is him right here. And he looks so much like the portrait. I'll kind of zoom in so you can see him standing there with his father and the drawing. So it's Rembrandt. He's the golden child. And Charles Willson Peale even gives him the opportunity to paint the President of the United States from life when he's just 17 years old. It's pretty incredible. From that one sitting in life, Rembrandt Peale would go on to create dozens of copies of paintings of George Washington. It's basically his livelihood. Congress would buy one copy of it for about $2,000. It would hang in the Senate chamber, and you know, it gives you a sense in terms of how successful you could be painting the president. This one is known as the patriarch, the father of the fatherland, or the father of his country. These are also known as like his porthole paintings, where we can see George Washington through this oval portal. He's framed with these oak leaves. He's got, you know, these clouds behind him. He looks more like a myth than a real person, right? But we do have that trompe l'oeil element where the fabric sort of spills out of the porthole into our space. Now, like I said, he made many copies of this, and there's actually a version of it that's in the collection of the White House. We can see these are two different administrations, but it's the same symbol of power that stands in for both of them, hanging over the mantle in the Oval Office. In fact, there's even a portrait of Bill Clinton where we can see Rembrandt Peale's portrait of Washington in the background. I just have to tell you this one really juicy detail about Bill Clinton's portrait. This one was done in 2005, and later on, the artist admitted that this strange shadow over here was supposed to be the shadow of the blue dress. I'll leave it at that. It's pretty good. So Rembrandt Peale was painting all these founding fathers that his own father had introduced him to. And no family in American history has left us with a more complete visual record of the country's early leaders and great thinkers. This is, of course, Thomas Jefferson. This was painted in 1800 when he was serving as vice president, and it became one of the most popular images of Jefferson. And it was lauded at the time for his warmth and sincerity. So now we turn our attention to Rembrandt's self-portrait. I love this self-portrait. So we have this notion. Charles Willson Peale has given Rembrandt everything he withheld from his first son, Raphael. He's giving him the training, the access, the opportunity. And that is the kind of parental belief that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So in 1828, Rembrandt paints this self-portrait. He's 50 years old. He's already celebrated on 2 continents, and we can see he is fully confident of his own talents. He follows in his father's footsteps, and I love the similarity in their glasses here. Side by side, we can see that they are a little bit different. Charles Willson Peale has pushed up those glasses, and he looks like the eternal tinkerer who's sort of been caught in the moment between different ideas here. And Rembrandt, on the other hand, faces us head on. He is direct, he's composed, he's deliberate, and the loose painterly way he has sketched in his jacket against this sort of clearly rendered face, that is no accident. That is the technique of Rembrandt, his namesake, the Dutch master that he's named for. So here he's kind of showing off. Rembrandt Peale goes on to found his own museum as well. This one's in Baltimore. The building still stands. It's still a museum today. And I guess Rembrandt was so interested in how you illuminate all of these objects in the collection that he got gaslight to the museum, and in doing so, essentially got gaslight to the entire city. He also followed in his father's footsteps in that had his own large brood, a big family, and he followed that naming convention. He started naming his children after famous artists. So these are portraits of some of his children. This is Michelangelo over here, another big name, big shoes to fill. And over here on the right, two of his daughters, Eleanor and Rosalba Peale. Rosalba is a reference to a famous Venetian artist from the 1700s. And believe it or not, Charles Willson Peale also had a daughter named Rosalba Carrera. Unfortunately, she passed away in infancy. So here is his son carrying on that legacy, also naming a daughter after a famous woman artist. So in this case, Rosalba Carrera Peale was able to become an artist in her own right. Here's another portrait of her by her father, but here's an example of her artwork over here on the right. She painted the woman artist that she was named for. This is pure invention at this point because this woman was long dead and she didn't know who she was painting. But this portrait by Rosalba Carrera Peale is actually on display in my hometown museum. So it's 2 generations removed from Charles Willson Peale, but we can see how that influence continued to spread. Rembrandt Peale lost his first wife and ended up marrying another artist. He married a woman named Harriet Caney, and she had actually been one of his students. She was already widowed as well, and she was already a working artist in her own right. We can see Rembrandt's portrait of her on the left, and on the right, an example of one of her Hudson River School style landscapes. She wrote in a letter to a friend that they were always their most happy when they were in their studios with pencils in hand. So it seems like a happy union there. Like his father, Rembrandt painted self-portraits throughout his life. We actually have a 17-year age difference between these two images. In 1828, when he was 50, he looked like he owned the world. And 17 years later, he's silver-haired, he's settled into his second marriage, and he looks like somebody who's taking stock rather than staking claims here. So he's sort of evening out. He gets a great deal of publicity in his old age. At the end of this extraordinary career of his, we can see a feature of him in Ballou's pictorial. He's referred to as the Nestor of American art, sort of like the elder statesman. This is a photograph of him by the famous Civil War photographer Matthew Brady, although it's before the Civil War. And now, I mean, this is a great portrait painter being rendered in a whole new medium, right? It's kind of incredible to think of. But he lived this nice long life and was really seen as like a national treasure by the end. We are going to round out our look at Rembrandt with this one last image. It's really considered his masterwork, and it's from much earlier in his career. This is a work that the National Gallery paid a record breaking at the time $4 million for back in 1985. It was a record for any American art ever sold at auction. It is just so wonderfully Peale in so many ways. We have a Peale brother. We've got the spectacles. We actually have two pairs of spectacles. We have this nod to the natural world. These are geraniums here. And apparently, this was like the first ever geranium in the United States. So it was a rare species at the time. And Rembrandt was able to paint all of this with this freshness, with this intimacy, with this remarkable realism. This is all entirely unlike his portraits of George Washington. It's not a monument. Instead, this is like an intimate moment. It's practically a double portrait between his brother here and this potted plant. And this is actually a portrait of Rubens Peale. So I'm going to use that as a segue to our last brother here. This is a short section for us to cover. Rubens Peale. Rubens Peale had notoriously bad eyesight. That's actually why he has two pairs of spectacles in that painting. We can see another portrait of Rubens Peale from about 6 years later, also by his brother Rembrandt. So Charles Willson looked at this son of his who couldn't really see, and he decided he's not going to be an artist, even though he's named for one, but he could be useful. So Rubens Peale goes on to be this great museum administrator. He runs his father's museum, he runs his brother's museum in Baltimore, and then he even opens up another Peale museum in New York City. And this one was supposed to be more of like a dignified affair. There was a lot of natural history, collections, and displays in that particular museum. But I guess in order to keep the crowds coming and keep yourself in the news, they would occasionally hold seances and mesmerism, which is what the image here is on the right. So Rubens was running it all. He ran the whole thing. And then something amazing happened. Years after his own father, Charles Willson Peale, passes away, and all that expectation of being an artist, it's all long gone. Rubens Peale gets cataracts. And somehow that corrects the vision problem that he had had his entire life. And he begins painting. He's in his 70s, he's in his 80s. And now all of a sudden he's painting with this joyfulness that shows like he's been waiting to see the world like this all along. So there's like this vibrancy to this little still life that we're looking at here. And they are considered, you know, some of the best still lifes of the era. And he doesn't have to paint for a client. There's no expectations here. There's just this joyfulness. So I have just one more Rubens Peale painting for you. This one is about 12 inches tall and about 17 inches across. It's very small. It is this quietly triumphant painting in the Peale story because I feel like it carries the ghost of all of these other Peales in it. We have the pressed napkin right here on the left side of the composition. It's like he's thinking of his brother Raphaelle as he's painting this fruit here. We also have over on the right the actual fruit peel as well. He's thinking all the way back to maybe with the first time his brother or his father ever painted one of those visual puns into a family portrait. And then we have the fact that this sweet little still life is actually now in the collection of the White House, just like Raphael's works that we've already seen. I think that Charles Willson Peale would have been stunned by this achievement and he would have been so proud. It's really amazing to think that all these boys accomplished so much. Here we have a portrait of Rubens Peale later in his life. Now, he also got married, he also had a lot of kids, and he also followed the naming convention to a certain degree of naming his children after famous artists. In this case, this little kid right here is actually named Charles Willson Peale after his father. Now, what's really interesting is that a lot of the daughters and nieces are getting into the art game by this point. We have the person who painted this image of Rubens Peale was actually his daughter, and then the person who painted this image of Rubens Peale's wife and their son was actually his niece, or Charles Willson Peale's niece. So it's Sarah Miriam Peale who painted the image over here on the right. So we have that family tree of artists growing and growing and growing. It's really just remarkable. We will wind up this look at the Peels very quickly with a quick conclusion here. We have all of these self-portraits of Charles Willson Peale. We know he wore so many hats, right? He was a naturalist, a museum founder, an artist, a soldier, an inventor, all of these things. He embodied the promise of this new republic, and he helped lay the very foundations for art and science and civic culture. And he did so in one extraordinary lifetime. But it's really the family connections that really mattered when it came to Charles Willson Peale. And that had this rippling effect through so many lives and generations. What we're looking at here is this tender lamplight scene. It's Charles Willson Peale painting his little brother once again in old age now. This is James Peale, who you remember specialized in miniatures. And he's gazing at a little miniature portrait here. And in this case, it's an image of Rosalba Peale, Charles Willson Peale's granddaughter. And in this case, the miniature is a real painting, and it was actually painted by Peale, James Peale's daughter. So it's all of these layers and generations baked into this one painting here, this understanding that their legacy went on and on. So we'll end with Charles Willson Peale's final self-portrait. The light that falls on that head at 83 illuminates something larger than one man. It illuminates a mind that imagined what American culture could be. Then he built it, he excavated it, and he painted it, and he created one of America's first artistic dynasties. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time and attention. I welcome any questions or comments you have for me about the Peels. And hopefully you feel just excited about this as I do. I can't believe all of the connections here.
Jane, Joe is asking, um, uh, how did he pass away? And I think that must be Charles Wilson because it's
Oh
early
yeah,
in the
good
talk.
question. I think it was just old age. He was I think it's pretty amazing that he lived into his mid 80s, but I believe it was just old age. I don't know. I don't have the specific on that, Joe. I'm sorry. I
Um,
see Jeffrey's question about where was Peale's museum located in New York City. Apparently, it was on Broadway in a building that was known as the Parthenon. It doesn't look like the Parthenon to me, but it no longer exists, unfortunately. Yeah.
Jane, I have a question from one of the early slides. Um,
Sure.
the 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 picture of the outside of the museum.
Hmm.
Can we look at that?
Sure. Let's see. Way back.
Way back.
Sorry
Sorry.
for the whiplash. Let's see. Was it that one?
This one.
Yep.
Is there underwear hanging on the wall there?
It was their house. And look, there's the little sign that says Peale's Museum. So I think this was the house part, and this was the gallery that they built, and these were the skylights. And
Okay.
yeah, people
That's
just
so
live in there.
interesting.
I mean, museum standards have definitely changed since then.
I
It's
guess so.
really funny, isn't it? And what's even funnier is that like multiple generations essentially painted this same view. I think there was like a lot of nostalgia around this idea of like, oh, the old museum, right? The old museum with the laundry.
There are a couple more questions in the Q&A. Do you want me to read them?
Hmm. Oh, I can read them. Elaine said the picture of George Washington on a mantle looks like the Oval Office today with all the gold in front of it. Yes, in fact it is. So it's just interesting to me because presidents get to pick what art they'd like to have on view. I'm eternally fascinated by that. And I just think it's interesting that such different administrations both went for the same portrait of Washington from Rembrandt Peale. Isn't that kind of amazing? So yeah, so this is the current administration and obviously Obama over there on the left. And then Pam said, how are the paintings of the Peale women faring in museums today? Is it only the men who are prominent today? I think, the stories of the men have been thoroughly researched and thoroughly explored. And I think only probably in the past few decades has there been more interest in the women and how they contributed and what their training was and how they flourished too. So I think those stories are kind of rising to the top, but they still at this point are probably considered secondary to the main characters that we looked at today. And then Francine said, are there any Peale descendants that were artists in the 20th century or are currently artists? Francine, I love that question. I'm not sure. I asked Chat GPT and I don't think they came up with anybody. So I think it sort of ended in the late 19th century. But wouldn't that just be so wonderful? I mean, it almost makes me want my husband's a practicing artist. Almost makes me want him to get his DNA tested because if you could just claim you are part of that artistic family, I mean, you'd get so much press just based right off of that. So anybody who's trying to launch a career as an artist, go out and get your DNA tested. Oh, Joe, you're sweet. What's coming up next month in June? Oh, next month is my new talk is on the power of pigment and the meaning of different colors in art, the history of it too. So that will be a fun one. Thanks, Joe.
That will be fun. We don't have you scheduled for another talk yet, Jane, but I think it would be lovely to have you back in the fall. So we'll
Thank you.
we'll work on that. Any other questions before we leave? Uh, okay, I think that's it. So Jane, thank you so much for this talk. It was
Okay.
wonderful. And I think we'll leave it there and say good night.
All
So
right.
have a good night, everyone.
Take good care. Thanks for coming.